This video is going to look at the relationships between D versus T, V versus T, and A versus T graphs. So this will be the first in the series, and this is going to simply look at D versus T graphs that are in a straight line, so they are moving at a constant rate. So there are three different ways that a D versus T graph can show this. So I have a negative slope, and this means that I'm going backwards. In any D versus T graph, whatever my negative slope is, it means that I'm going backwards. This means that my V versus T graph will be in the fourth quadrant. If I have a straight line in my D versus T graph, this means that my V versus T graph will be a horizontal line. So a straight line, negative slope D versus T graph will result in a horizontal line in my V versus T graph in the fourth quadrant. If my V versus T graph is a horizontal line, then my A versus T graph will be a horizontal line on the x-axis. So negative slope, fourth quadrant. Straight line, horizontal line, horizontal line. If my D versus T graph is a horizontal line, doesn't matter where it is, it means that I'm standing still. I might be standing still at the start line, ahead of the start line, behind the start line. I'm just standing still, which means that I have no speed. So my velocity versus time graph will be a horizontal line on the x-axis. And I'm just hashing this so you can see this. Remember that anything that's a horizontal line on my V versus T graph will be a horizontal line on the x-axis for an A versus T graph. The third type of line I can have in my D versus T graph is a positive slope. It means I'm moving forward. Right? So the steeper the slope, the more rapidly I'm moving forward. I'm just moving forward. So that will show up in the first quadrant for a V versus T graph. Again, this is a straight line on my D versus T graph, which means that it will be a horizontal line in my V versus T graph. And then if it's a horizontal line on my V versus T graph, it will be on the zero axis, the x-axis, as a horizontal line on my A versus T graph. So you'll notice that whenever I have a straight line, whether it's negative, zero slope, or positive on my D versus T graph, they are always horizontal lines on my V versus T graphs, and they will always be horizontal lines and on the x-axis on an A versus T graph. If it is a negative slope in my D versus T graph, my V versus T graph will have the line in the fourth quadrant. If it's a positive slope, it will always be a line in the first quadrant in the V versus T graph. So I hope you can see these relationships and they are a little more clear of the relationship between the D versus T, the V versus T, and the A versus T graph. And this is just for straight line D versus T graphs.